Welcome to part 4. Napoleon conquered much of Europe. Let's take a look at the reading. The reading is chapter 21.3. Go ahead and read how Napoleon conquers much of Europe and how France goes from a state in 1789 of trying to overthrow, in a sense, their absolute monarchy, only 10 years later to have a obscure general come into power and eventually become emperor of one of the greatest empires Europe had seen since the days of ancient Rome. So read, you won't want to miss. A lot more details in it than what we're going to review here. So give you time to read, and we'll see you in a minute. Here's our review for the chapter. After your reading, you have taken a look a little bit about Napoleon and his rise to power. And I think that this is a great figure to top off the French Revolution with, because it does tell you that over time, as people get unsatisfied with the revolution that ended up happening in France, that they just seem really content with an emperor again, somebody who does have absolute power and probably exerts that absolute power definitely to a point beyond that of perhaps Louis XIV, that great Sun King we looked at the beginning of the unit. So let's go ahead and check out what we got in our chapter here. So I want to introduce you to Napoleon Bonaparte. A lot of people don't actually know him, which I'm surprised when I talk with them on a day-to-day basis and I bring up Napoleon and, all my conversations about history. And people are like, oh, is that the guy from that movie? And no, I don't think he used any dynamite. He did use explosives. He was a general. I think there's a story of him filling cannons with like a shotgun type of stuff to kind of scatter across crowds and spray more than just a cannonball would. So he's brilliant that way. But this Napoleon is one that you probably want to remember if we want to remember anything about history. Napoleon's one of those important figures that I just find it's interesting that he's becoming more and more forgotten in the general knowledge of society. So let's fill that gap. So in 1799, Napoleon stages a coup. That means he marches in and overthrows the government. He does so sort of legally. He overthrows the directory and he becomes one of the consuls. Then he becomes first consul. Then he finds appointment to consul for life. And then later he becomes crowned emperor. So you see that transition here. Now, he's a military guy. You often see Napoleon with his hand tucked in his vest or whatever. Up here, he's mounted on a horse, all glorious and military-like, a younger Napoleon. And then here, crowned, all magnificent. We go back, look at this image, and compare it to the Sun King of Louis XIV. Not much different there. Very interesting. Okay, let's look and see how this ends up happening. So Napoleon is actually not even French technically at all. He's from Sardinia, which is kind of at the time like a French island in the Mediterranean, but really more Italian. Napoleon rose through the French army. He was a very successful military student. And so because of his, knack for military and leadership, he easily rises through the ranks of this young revolutionary army and eventually commands an army. He very soon becomes, marches on different campaigns in northern Italy and such, and becomes a very famous general in all of Europe. Already before, while the French Revolution is underway. There's a little bit of a story about how he actually saves the National Convention from an imposing army, and perhaps by doing so, saves the revolution and the revolutionaries during the early part of the French Revolution. So he's around in the background while the whole French Revolution is going on. Okay, born in 1769. So he was, definitely, 20 years old when the French Revolution began. And so he's a fairly young guy here as the revolution begins, but would work his way up as quite a young man even when he takes full power. But in any case, The directory over time loses the confidence of the people. That five-member of the executive power of the directory becomes very corrupt. And as much peace as they had, that they didn't in a long time, the directory just wasn't satisfying people. And there was an opportunity for Napoleon. He marches in with his army. He actually takes like the half of the legislative body and kind of drives them out, and then makes the other half dissolve itself and instate him and two others as consuls. So now it's kind of a three-member executive power, of which he eventually became known as first consul, and then the only consul, and then eventually consul for life, and then eventually emperor, as it says here. So he kind of gradually manipulates the people into accepting him into eventually the position of emperor. Okay, so this is a very gradual thing. He is a manipulative mastermind whereby he uses things like plebiscites and actually calls upon the perceived will of the people that they are making these decisions, though he is manipulating them to make the decisions that he wants. And so, yes, when they say, yeah, you can be consul for life, that's a pretty crazy thing for people to decide or vote in favor of. Okay. Let's see here. So there is a little bit of an interesting story to look at his coronation as emperor, and that is that on December 2nd, 1804, so this is about 5 years after 1799, where he becomes emperor. So this is a gradual process where he takes and takes and takes a little bit more and more and more and more and more power. But at this coronation ceremony, which actually happens in Notre Dame, that's the big cathedral that burnt about a year ago, is a very historic place, because that's the place where Napoleon walks down the aisle, is about to be crowned emperor, takes the crown from the Pope. The Pope, the head of the Catholic Church, was there to represent the will of God or whatnot, and takes that crown and takes it from the Pope, puts it on his own head. And in doing so, it was a symbol that there's no authority greater that can place a crown upon the head of Napoleon. He will do it himself, just like he's conquered and achieved power himself. It's through no outside force that gives him his power. It's himself. So not even the Pope can symbolically crown him. Only Napoleon can. So very symbolic moment. As Napoleon's ruling, there's a couple things that end up happening, and these are some great things that we still sort of see today in our more modern governments and countries. And he made some of these improvements. It wasn't necessarily like Napoleon becomes emperor and suddenly France returns to the old regime in the same way that it was under an absolute ruler king. It didn't. He made a lot of adaptations and changes to society. France certainly did not return to the ways of the old regime with the three estates and kind of medieval law and stuff like that. So let's go ahead and look at these 5 things. Number 1, economy. So as we know, France is in economic upheaval, and through the revolution and even prior to the revolution. So he tries to actually fix that. And he slows inflation, which retains the value of French currency. He balances the budget, and he sets up a national bank to try to help achieve these things. So these are things he's putting in place as his government that would bring financial stability to a country in chaos. That was very, very important, and kind of sets the benchmark of how to bring your country into economic stability when it's extremely disturbed. And so that's a good thing. A lot of people benefited from that, especially from the slowed inflation. Your money has value, and that's an important thing to consider. Alrighty, next one is socially. His social considerations or improvements to France. Well, there are 2, 3, if we include these religious ones down here, because there are 3 groups of powerful people in France that Napoleon has to appease in order to hang on to his power. The first are the old second estate, the nobility. Another one is the upper third estate, the bourgeoisie. And then another is the clergy, the first estate, the old first estate. Now, if you can satisfy these 3 groups, that is what you need to do to have their permission, in a sense, to retain your power. And he does that very strategically. So if you remember the emigres, he invites them back to France. The émigrés were the nobility that fled France, and Napoleon invites them back without fear of punishment or threat. They come back, which is good. You want your nobility, the people who have wealth and qualifications and whatever experience, to come back to the country without risk, and they do. So they flock back, whereas during the revolution they would have been fearful to come back, for fear of being punished or imprisoned or whatever. Right? So they do come back. Now the second is the bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie could be satisfied by allowing them to hold office or public positions or whatever, or to rise through the ranks, through merit, not through class. Now, if you remember, in the third estate, in the old regime, anybody in the third estate couldn't hold office, even though some of those people were more wealthy and more educated and probably more qualified than the nobility who could. So the bourgeoisie being satisfied by Napoleon in this way was very important. So those are two social improvements. A religious one, which is also sort of a social one, is the recognition of Catholicism, again, or the church in France, as the vast majority of French were still Catholic, and this agreement that was signed with the Pope, this Concordat. And this was important because it reverses some of those impositions of the state on the church that happened through the French Revolution. Now, I think the state or the government is still responsible for having a say in which bishops are appointed, and that doesn't fall under the authority of the Pope. But for the most part, Napoleon and the Pope need to make a bit of an agreement here, and that's what happens. So that's good overall, even though it's not the most optimal. You still have a Catholic Church controlled by the state, which isn't a good situation. However, there is a religious freedom that is improved in France. There's this toleration of Protestants and Jews, whereas before there would have been a persecution of them. So you see this religious freedom being a value that is brought in by Napoleon. If we look here, we see legally, he works out a comprehensive legal code, the Napoleonic Code. This is interesting. You scrap the legal system and you rewrite it, and he drafts this Napoleonic Code, which actually takes all of France and gives upon it the single set of laws. Remember, this is kind of your judicial backbone, and it abolishes the estates, it grants equality to all, and it is something that is then applied to all, regardless of estate or status or whatever. So that's really important, where you have a law that applies to everybody. And the Napoleonic Code was an early form of this kind of universal law that applied to that whole country. Very cool. Territorially, of course, he goes in on different campaigns and whatever, and through agreements and whatever, he's able to extend France's military power and create a continental empire across Europe. And nobody's actually really able to threaten to stop him very successfully anyways. Okay, now some negatives were his changes didn't all follow those Enlightenment ideals or revolutionary progresses that had been made. So for instance, it does censor newspapers, and he reserves that ability to censor newspapers. In other words, eliminate complete freedom of the press and freedom of speech, which is an Enlightenment, highly valued Enlightenment right. Okay, it takes away some of the women's rights that had been gained during the French Revolution, namely in realms of equality and holding office and things like that. It does restore slavery in the colonies. We know that slavery is something in the southern U.S. at this point in time as well. So in the other colonies that the French owned in the New World, that was reinstated. This idea of saying, yeah, all men are born equal unless you're a slave, then slavery is permissible. And the last one is the biggest question mark or biggest flag for us, is that it makes Napoleon exempt from the law. So while he drafts this Napoleonic Code where everybody is bound to it and has kind of equal access or treatment under it, it applies to everybody and applied to everybody equally, except to Napoleon, who actually thinks that he needs to break the law every day to maintain his absolute power. I think that's a big question, a big flag for us to say, oh, if a leader thinks he has to break the law to hold power, that doesn't make him kind of a dictator who thinks he's above the law. And actually, I would be very concerned about that type of leadership. That's why when we value in our country the rule of law, it means that our prime minister can't just go and break the law just because he's prime minister. He has to follow the law just like everybody else, has to follow the rules just like everybody else, and can't dabble in these different things that would question his responsibility to be lawful and to follow due process and all of that. I say that kind of smirking because of different scandals leaders have found themselves in modern times, including President Trump and Justin Trudeau as well. So let's take a brief look at the vast empire of Napoleon. This is the map that comes from your textbook. Napoleon's relentlessly victorious through his campaigns, even against what your textbook calls the Third Coalition, which I believe was, Prussia and Austria and the Russians and the British, who Napoleon was able to, for the most part, defeat. So he does win battle after battle after battle. He loses one here, down a naval battle. That means it's a battle at sea at Trafalgar in 1805. And that was actually quite a significant loss. It meant a benefit for the British who won that battle and a loss of naval power by the French. And that's going to be important because, as you see, Britain is not closed down. And in fact, from this advantage of being an island, which you'll see already repeating itself in history in World War One and World War Two, this advantage of being an island is that Great Britain is very difficult to take over and very difficult to defeat, especially if they have a strong navy, which they did. So Great Britain is the only country that's at war or not conquered or under the influence of Napoleon here, and largely because of Great Britain's strong navy, which will come into play later on in the next chapter. So, I mean, you also see the Kingdom of Sweden, but I don't know what they're doing up there. They're just not involved. They're probably busy reading Beowulf and stuff and studying some awesome literature like that. But they're not, an ally or a country overtaken by Napoleon. So what does Napoleon do? He sets up these puppet states in Spain, the German kingdoms, the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. And these little light green ones are set up as puppet states by largely his brothers who become leaders there and whatnot. So they still kind of retain their territories and centers of government. So it's not like they're all run from Paris, but they're still kind of within the territory of the French Empire. And then the purple, so Austria and Russia, namely, are they retain their independence. However, they are allied with Napoleon. In other words, he's signed these things. They've allied together so that he knows they're not going to come to war with him, and he's not going to go to war with them. And so that keeps him pretty safe in that they're not a threat to him in his position of power in Europe at the time. So these strong alliances with Austria and Russia actually make it look very, very much a solidified empire in Europe, because really his only threat is Great Britain. Okay. Now, although it's vast, and they say it's the biggest empire that spans or unites Europe of recent times, since the times of ancient Rome, it really isn't an empire that stands the test of time very long. This is not something that's very long lasting, and that's something that will be set up in our next chapter. Here's another look at a map. I think this map, see if my thing can go down, we'll look at the legend here. So it shows us the border of France prior to the outset of the French Revolution in 1789, which is very close to its present day borders. And Napoleon's empire spreads it to the dark green, as you can see, and the light green again becomes those puppet states that Napoleon sets up. We see that, this is basically the same as what our other ones are. It shows us a little bit more detail about some of the routes that were taken and other battles fought But you could see that I think it's interesting when you have historical maps, they look a lot different than the political maps that we see today. And sometimes you can have really interesting information on maps, such as routes of where people come and go from, and whatever locations of where battles are fought and all that type of stuff. Okay. I think this one goes, Napoleon. Seems to me he had this like campaign in Egypt for a little while too. All right. So a bit of a shorter chapter, little less to look at in terms of Napoleon and his eventual rise to power, but still some things to review. So I'll give you some time to go ahead and take a look ahead at those review questions, see what you could do to come up with your conclusions about them, and we will review them very shortly. Let's begin our section review for this chapter. We will look at, first of all, some definitions. Let's look at coup. What is a coup? A coup is a swift, unexpected seizure of power. It's the exact thing that Napoleon does as general with his army to go into a weak government, force it to overthrow or to cancel itself, and take power himself. So he stages a coup. He overthrows the power that had it and takes it for himself. Okay, what's a concordat? Well, this is an agreement, simply put. In this case, the agreement that Napoleon had with the Catholic Church and with the Pope. We go ahead and look at identify. Of course, we're going to try to identify Napoleon Bonaparte. Who is Napoleon Bonaparte? I hope you can answer this a little better than you could at the beginning of the chapter. He was a military genius, the French general, somebody who rose through power through the military, through the French Revolution, had continental success and reputation as a good general, and eventually becomes Emperor of France, consul for life, and all that other good stuff. Sets up the Napoleonic Code. Let's define that. So the Napoleonic Code was the code of laws that was commissioned by Napoleon. A lot of countries to this day, or as countries were at this point expanding or drafting their own code of laws to replace these medieval laws that they may have had, looked to the Napoleonic Code actually for inspiration. Okay, so it's an influential code of laws even to this day. Let's look at some of our questions and try to ask and answer, how did the National Convention and the Directory both help Napoleon rise to power? These are two governments of the French Revolution, and Napoleon rises to power through them. Let's take a look and see how. Well, number one, he actually defends the place where the National Convention was meeting, as I mentioned in the slides a little bit earlier. And in so doing, potentially preserves the French Revolution. And they saw that they recognize that, and they appoint Napoleon to a higher position. I mean, through his merit and ability to do that, defend as a young military leader. Eventually rises through the military to become a very successful general, as we've already stated. Now, and by the way, it doesn't come easy. It comes through great skill and great work. Just like these other guys like Danton and Marat, like these guys are successful because they employ their skills and they work and they kind of achieve the status that they do. So it does come with hard work. Not to say that hard work was pointed towards something good, but we can recognize some good skill when we see it. And Napoleon certainly was a good leader and very tactful militarily, for the most part. Okay, I think he got a little bit full of himself by the end and thought he was invincible, but a little more on that next chapter. How about the Directory? Well, the Directory is who appointed him commander of the French army. And I like this idea. In fact, let's just go back to our textbook really quickly. There's this prediction by a British statesman who says, "In the weakness of authority, some popular general shall draw the eye of all men upon himself. Armies will obey him on his personal account. The person who really commands the army is your master." In the face of a weak government like the Directory, the British are predicting that really your true leader or your true person in power is the one who holds your army or the power of your army. Now, why would a British be able to have this insight than the French? Well, because if you remember about 100 years before, a little more than that, you also have this similar thing happening with Oliver Cromwell, who develops this amazing fighting machine army, and then himself is able to overthrow a parliament and take power for himself as Lord Protector of England. And so, it's not like history is isolated things that haven't happened before. There are a lot of things that hold in common here. And the fact that the Directory appoints Napoleon as commander of the French army and that the Directory is weak really says that it's inevitable that perhaps Napoleon and his ambition for power and his ability to take it because he has the military under his control really, was bound to be the master of France. Okay. Sorry about that. Went on a tangent, but it gives you this idea that, history there's a lot of commonalities that happen through time. The more we study history, the more we see these, patterns of repetition in a sense. How did Napoleon expand his power? Through plebiscites. Well, plebiscite is going and asking the people to cast their vote on a given matter. Initially, Napoleon proposes laws and puts it towards plebiscite that people readily pass. How does that affect this? Well, they see, hey, we're all agreeing as people, we're voting in these things, and it actually becomes kind of like the status quo, the norm to vote in favor of something because it's easily passed. And you don't want to, when you get into this expectation that if a plebiscite is proposed, you accept it. You accept it. You cast your vote in favor. Now, people still rejected it, but the majority, all they needed was the majority to say yes to that proposed law. And as Napoleon does this, it kind of sets the expectation that every time a plebiscite comes, everybody else is going to vote yes. So I want to be, because of peer pressure in a sense, I want to be voting yes and on the yes side as well. And it's a very powerful thing that he's able to manipulate the people into thinking that they're the ones in power, where he is in fact manipulating them to pass things he knows they're going to pass, so that later on he can pass things that they probably wouldn't have passed had he not set up this culture of basically agreeing with what the plebiscite was proposing. I hope that made sense. But when it comes down to saying, let's make Napoleon consul for life, seriously, if that was the first plebiscite that people were forced to think about, I think a lot of them would have been like, okay, I don't know the outcome of this, so I'm going to vote critically on this. And if you didn't have this expectation that most people are going to vote in favor of this, so I want to be on that side, the winning side of the voting tally, then I think a lot of us would be like, no, I don't think so. We're not going to vote in favor of this ridiculous thing of saying he's consul for life. Like that means, all the hard fought things we did in the French Revolution to like fight for democracy and our say in the matter of who's in leadership has no meaning anymore. Okay, he can manipulate the people into changing their mind that readily. Number 4, what policy did Napoleon adopt toward the emigres? We said that he welcomes them as long as they behave politically. What actions won him the support of the bourgeoisie? It was his system of merit and promotions, the fact that they didn't have to belong to the second estate in order to hold these offices that they deserved. What agreements does he make with the Catholic Church? Okay, he makes this agreement, this concordat, that recognizes Catholicism as the faith of the great majority of Frenchmen, reunites that relationship with the church and with the Pope, and improves that, which is good. You want the majority of Frenchmen, this is tactful of him, the majority of the faithful French Catholics to be in favor of Napoleon. And if he's going to impose things or reject the church, that would be to his detriment. But because he accepts the church and gives it back some of its authority, he then gets accepted by the simple peasantry who were faithful Catholics. And number 5, how does the Napoleonic Code carry out the ideals of the French Revolution? Well, in the code, it doesn't codify in law these 3 estates. So it abolishes the 3 estates, and it grants equal rights to everybody, in that everybody is under the law and is treated by it and governed by it equally, regardless of status, wealth, education, whatever, nobility, lineage. How does it limit liberty? Well, the Napoleonic Code did censor newspapers, it limited freedom of the press, freedom of speech. It abolishes the rights of women to hold property, so it takes away some of the equality of women. And it restores slavery in the colonies, so the idea of slavery in that some people are less or can be enslaved, uh, that concept just being incompatible with the thought that all people are equal. And then finally, the man who was above the law himself, and that would have been Napoleon, who the law doesn't limit. So those are our questions of review. Our next chapter is Napoleon's empire collapses, and that's the last little bit on the French Revolution and Napoleon. So tune in next time for a final part of Napoleon's empire collapsing to the ground. Very interesting. Don't be lame. We will see you later.